Ole Miss is underrated in the latest FanDuel over-under win totals. We'll tell you why.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Locked On Ole Miss podcast is the most watched Ole Miss podcast out there, hosted by me, Steven Willis, a 10-year veteran member of the national media and former Ole Miss staff member as well. Today, we break down FanDuel's 8.5 over-under win total for Ole Miss and why that schedule actually sets up for a 9+ win season in 2025. With 8 home games and likely one underdog spot on the road at Georgia, Ole Miss is in great shape. But sportsbooks seem shook by the Kentucky game a year ago, raising some eyebrows about home losses to underdogs. Plus, we ran a ChatGPT simulation for Austin Simmons and Logan Diggs this season, and let's say they just don't disappoint. And in hoops, Ole Miss just dropped a must-win game at Vanderbilt, setting up a tough few weeks ahead in a likely must-win game against Oklahoma. We're free and available on all the podcast apps and on YouTube. Thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen every day. And a special shout out to the insiders and everydayers who make the show what it is. And don't forget, for a second listen, check out Chris Gordy at Locked On SEC or Corey Burton at Locked On Vandy for other SEC and college sports perspectives. You know how we feel about perspectives. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bet if that first $5 bet wins. So, FanDuel released Ole Miss's win total, their over-under that they released, that they do each and every single year. And this year, they're saying Ole Miss's over-under is at 8.5 wins. Now, it's pretty kind of cool to think about that we're probably 10 years away from, and that being an unbelievable over-under number for Ole Miss football. But this number is underrated in the 2025 Ole Miss season. This schedule that Ole Miss has sets up entirely for Ole Miss to win games, especially at home. They're going to be favored in every one of their home games this season. They're going to be favored in all but probably one of their road games this season. So for Ole Miss to hit 8.5 wins and especially hit the under, that means that the 2025 season was at best a disappointment. At worst, a disaster, and you would like to think probably if Ole Miss hit under, there was an injury involved as well. At 8.5 wins for Ole Miss, that's interesting because you figure the Georgia loss, that's the game that Ole Miss is going to be the underdog in probably this season. The other 11 games Ole Miss should be favored in. That means that Ole Miss loses 3 of those if Ole Miss hits under. That means they lose against LSU, that lose against South Carolina, they lose against Florida, all games that Ole Miss are likely going to be favored in. And because of that, they go under. So like I said, an abject disaster or what was going on. If you look at the reasons why, they probably look at the fact that Jackson Dart is leaving. It's a very rudimentary 30,000 feet view. When you look at the players that are leaving versus the players that are coming in, there's obviously reason for concern in the Ole Miss football program, thinking that Ole Miss is going to take a step back. You have Austin Simmons, who the last season went 19-32, 282 yards, 2 touchdowns, and interceptions. It doesn't matter how talented he was. It doesn't matter that over the course of practices last season, a lot of people talked about him looking better on the field than what was out there. Not comparing him to Jackson Dart, just saying in practice, everybody's been raving about Austin Simmons for multiple years at this point. It doesn't matter about any of that stuff. It doesn't matter that Ole Miss brought in Deshaun Stribling out of Oklahoma State, who caught nearly 1,000 yards worth of passes a year ago with no quarterback. And for his career, 161 catches, 2,153 yards, 17 touchdowns for the original Washington State signing, which is also pretty funny that Ole Miss actually plays Washington State this season. It doesn't matter that Logan Diggs, nearly a 2,000-yard rusher, is prepared to step in and take over as a running back this year with nearly 2,000 yards. All that you think of when you look at that is Ole Miss is replacing a quarterback, replacing a running back, and replacing a top wide receiver, the skill positions aren't adding up. It's not about what you're adding. It is about what is going on with the Ole Miss program. These new players are really good. So we'll see exactly how that goes. That is the reason that Ole Miss has this over under to where they dropped it down. That is the thing that everybody needs to keep in mind. Ole Miss is at 8.5 wins because those players moved out. Ole Miss lost Walter Nolan. Ole Miss lost Princely and Mamiel and Trey Amos, Pooh Paul. Those players are gone. So that is what the betting lines are looking at. So Ole Miss might be underrated, but that's because they just don't know exactly what Ole Miss has coming back. And to put this in perspective, FanDuel is also kind of hedging their bets. Ole Miss has the 6th rated odds to be the SEC championship and the SEC champion next season, behind the usual suspects going on. That's a 10-1 odd to win the entire SEC. That is a very, very good situation for Ole Miss. So that while they say that Ole Miss's over-under is going to be below that, the odds for them in the SEC is admitting that they could be much above that if the transfer portal hits. Remember, I've talked all the time about Ole Miss and them being a transfer portal school and that you're going to have a yo-yo effect. Now, it's not going to be as bad as Florida State. I think I saw a podcast earlier in the week. Maybe it was Michael Borky asking the question, is Ole Miss going to be the Florida State of next year? No, that's not going to happen. The reason Florida State dropped is because they didn't have a quarterback. The quarterback didn't pan out. If you literally thought that there was a severe question with Austin Simmons, then yes, the win total would fluctuate even more. But Austin Simmons being I don't want to say sure thing, but the impressive thing and everybody raving about him means that Florida State's not going to happen. Even if Austin Simmons plays poorly for Austin Simmons, Ole Miss likely wins 7 or 8 ball games in the season. That's the reason that these sports books are doing this. Their 30,000-foot view to where they look at metrics and passing yards coming back and rushing yards coming back and receiving yards coming back. All of that stuff is what they're paying attention to, not actually what got brought in. Where you have a Trey Wallace, who was the leading wide receiver for Penn State, or Deshaun Stribling, who was the leading wide receiver for Oklahoma State. Those players are coming into a system along with a lot of tight ends and other skill players that are going to be fine. Listen, I do not want to basically say anything negative about a Lane Kiffin offense. They're going to figure it out. They just are from time to time. And when you look at this over-under win total and you look at the fact that Lane Kiffin's going to figure out offense, when you look at the fact that Pete Golding's going to figure out the defense as well, I think 8.5 is a low-end win total. Even in 2022, when everything fell apart, Ole Miss still won 8 games that year. And that was with a disastrous end to the season to where you lost against Arkansas, Mississippi State, and Texas Tech, all games that you were favored in. Because of the Auburn situation, there would almost have to be outside circumstances that caused a situation to where you lost games over and over again. So we'll see exactly how that goes as well. You know what? We decided to have a little bit of fun. So we ran 1,000 simulations of the 2025 season. We've crunched the average outcome for Austin Simmons and Ole Miss. The results are game-changing. Don't go anywhere. March basketball is here, and there's no better way to get in on the action than with Prize Picks. It's the best place for daily fantasy sports. With Prize Picks, you pick more or less on at least 2 player projections, and if you're right, you can win up 1,000 times of your cash. It's a fast and easy way to keep every game exciting. This week, I'm building my lineup looking at Jason Tatum for more than 29 points and Anthony Davis. He's kind of a little bit injured at the moment. We'll see exactly how it goes as well. But the Dallas Mavericks maybe more than, 96 points in a game. We'll look at that as well. I love how I can make my picks in less than 60 seconds and stay engaged throughout the game. When I win, my money hits the account in as little as 15 minutes. No waiting around. Plus, I'm always excited for their Taco Tuesday deal where discount player projections add even more value to my lineup. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play that first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONCollege for $50 instantly after you play that first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. So we decided to have a little bit of fun after the FanDuel information came out over the weekend, and looking at that and was like, hey, we're going to do Monday's show based on those projections because I think those numbers are low. So we decided to run 1,000 simulations on the 2025 football season, and mainly looking at players involved and statistical lines and things like that. And we looked at how this would help Ole Miss, okay? Game by game, scores, all that. We decided to have a little bit of fun. If you're my age or older, or my age or younger, you've run simulations on video games and all of that. You would play the NCAA 13 and simulate the Ole Miss season just to see what would happen and stuff like that. Now with artificial intelligence, you have the ability to do that, I don't know, at home on your own. And ChatGPT allowed us to be able to run 1,000 simulations on the Ole Miss football schedule. We imported the Ole Miss football schedule because we ran one earlier to where the games didn't quite match up. There was a weird Alabama game that got thrown out in there as well. So looking at these games on the ChatGPT channel, it was interesting. And the first thing you notice is Austin Simmons. Austin Simmons and the projected stat from ChatGPT, 1,000 simulations. These were the average numbers. The things that jump off is that's a ton of passes. If that happens, Ole Miss is going to throw the football a lot. 3,703 yards. That's a great passing season. I think that would be good for third or fourth in Ole Miss history. 30 touchdowns, 8 interceptions for the Southpaw. It's pretty good. And it was really interesting to see exactly how it played out as well. You know, when you looked at the teams that he performed against, the teams he struggled against was interesting. He had no touchdown and 1 interception and 368 yards against the Kentucky Wildcats. A poor game at Kentucky. Ole Miss would end up winning that game according to projection, but we'll talk about that in just a second. In games like Georgia State, Tulane, the Citadel, the stats were lower because he got pulled out of the game and it wasn't need to throw the ball. I am so impressed by what artificial intelligence has become. But 319 yards, 2 touchdowns against Arkansas, 256, 2 touchdowns and a pick against Tulane, 340 yards, 4 touchdowns and an interception against LSU, 315 yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks against Washington State, 376 yards, 2 touchdowns and an interception against Georgia, 320 yards, 4 touchdowns, no picks against Oklahoma, 376 yards and a touchdown against South Carolina, 188 against the Citadel, 363, 2 touchdowns and a pick against Florida, and 245 yards and a pick against Mississippi State. His best performance of the year was against Georgia and South Carolina with 376 yards. His toughest game was at Kentucky. His most efficient was at Oklahoma. And if he's that efficient against Oklahoma, Ole Miss is going to win that game if we're going to be honest about it. It was pretty cool. 460 attempts, 301 completions, a completion percentage of 65.4%. There were several games with more than 40 attempted passes. There were 4 games of Austin Simmons with more than 30 completions. So what did we watch for? Or what did we learn? Or what did we learn from the ChatGPT whenever he did that? It was an efficient first year with over 30 completions, 4 times and a 65% completion rate, 4 TD passes against both LSU and Oklahoma, and his worst statistical games were against Kentucky and Mississippi State. That is what the ChatGPT simulation kind of taught us as well. Now, looking at some of these pretty cool things that popped up, Logan Diggs, 112 rushing yards and a touchdown against the Georgia State. Logan Diggs, 85 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns against Kentucky. Diggs, 105 rushing yards and a touchdown against Arkansas. 120 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns against Tulane. They think on ChatGPT that Ole Miss is going to be able to run the ball. 98 rushing yards against LSU, 110 rushing yards and a touchdown against Washington State, 75 rushing yards and a TD against Georgia. If that happens, that's going to be a great football game. It was a toss-up game in the ChatGPT simulation. The average score of the game was Ole Miss 27, Oklahoma 27. And that is with Austin Simmons having a day throwing the ball. Logan Diggs, 95 yards. So a key turnover one way or another could determine whether or not Ole Miss wins 8, 9, or 10 football games this season. Ole Miss beat Ole Miss over South Carolina 35-24 was another one they predicted. Logan Diggs, 130 rushing yards and a touchdown. He had 150 rushing yards, 2 TDs versus the Citadel, 90 rushing yards against Florida, and 115 yards and a touchdown against Mississippi State. ChatGPT had them at 9-3 this season and going to a bowl game, likely in the Citrus or the Gator Bowl or the ReliaQuest Bowl, that tier, just like they were in. Their final standings, probably about 5th in the SEC. Unlikely going to the title game because they think they lose to LSU and they think they lose to Georgia. Because of those losses, they think going to the title game could be difficult for Ole Miss this season. Again, this was 1,000 simulations. Going over there and running that, and these are the average numbers that came up in those 1,000 situations. So there's outliers up, there's outliers down. I'm sure there's the simulations where Ole Miss went 12-0 and won the national title. There's probably simulations where Ole Miss went 5-7 and didn't even go to a bowl game. But the average simulation had them here. You had Austin Simmons doing that. You had Logan Diggs doing what he did. If you want to look at those numbers, it's pretty exciting. I want to see a football season to where Austin Simmons has numbers like that. It was very Eli-like numbers as far as the number of passes, completions, the efficiency ratings, 37 touchdowns as a redshirt sophomore. Very Eli-like numbers. And if you want to look at the first year that a new quarterback takes over in the Lane Kiffin system, this is relevant as well. Matt Corral went 5-5. Jackson Dart went 8-5. The other years, the second years where there was an experienced quarterback in the system, Corral won 10 games, Dart won 10 games both years as well. An experienced quarterback seems to be a requirement for the Lane Kiffin system, but what about an Austin Simmons who's been in the system for 3 years? That will be interesting to see, because it won't just be a Matt Corral to where Lane Kiffin just walked in and COVID happened and all of that weird stuff happened and Ole Miss goes 5-5, or Jackson Dart transferring in and getting there on February 1st and playing a football game to start the season 6 months later. Austin Simmons has been there for 2 years. In fact, Austin Simmons is, of course, the spring away from graduating from school and entering this fall in graduate school. Austin Simmons basically is living life right. He's doing what he needs to do. And we all saw him going to the baseball game over the weekend, signing autograph to kids, him and Caden Lee. The chemistry he has with Caden Lee is going to be a big step with the Deshaun Stribling and a Trey Wallace and a Caleb Odom and a Caleb Cunningham and a Luke Haas and a Daquan Wright. All of the weapons that Ole Miss have offensively is going to be benefited by the experience that Austin Simmons has in the system. Austin Simmons has spent this offseason working on his leadership. He received a graduate level course in leadership from Jackson Dart. Jackson Dart didn't make every play. There's a lot of stuff he wants to take back, but one thing that he gets a gold star for is leadership. He built the team that was last year. I blame analytics for Ole Miss not going to the playoffs and playing honestly on that Monday night, if we're going to be real about it, but he built the team that had the most talent in Ole Miss history, and that should not be overlooked. So this was the 1,000 simulations. They think very highly of Austin Simmons and Logan Diggs. They think Ole Miss is going to win 9 games, but just miss the playoffs. That makes a little bit of sense as well. The Oklahoma game's kind of a toss-up game, that the average over 1,000 simulations is Ole Miss 27 and Oklahoma 27. That's pretty nuts. So that tells me that game at least is going to be fun to watch. So we'll see how it goes. In our final segment, we break down how Ole Miss blew a must-win game and now faces a high-stakes showdown against the Oklahoma Sooners on Saturday. Confidence is on the line. Can they bounce back? Stick around. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better way and no better place to get on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is super easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. So right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. So just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So, Ole Miss played a game at Vanderbilt over the weekend, and it started about as bad as it can start. Ole Miss found itself after 15 minutes in the game down by 19 points. They were down by 19 points. Now, credit to Ole Miss. Now, I do want to give credit to Ole Miss for this. They came all the way back and took the lead with about 8 minutes to go in the game. The problem is they spent so much energy trying to cut that lead down, and the disaster of the early start, they were kind of out of gas at the end. They looked out of gas. It was becoming harder to defend, harder to do what they had to do because they had to expend so much energy for that comeback. And that was interesting. When you look at the box score that happened, Vandy won the game 77-72. Ole Miss didn't shoot well early, kind of rebounded to ended up shooting about average. They missed their first 10 three-point shots, shot about 50% after that, had 11 turnovers, most of them in that first 15 minutes. They rebounded, kind of got obliterated in the rebounding compartment at the end of the game, and they fouled extremely too much. And Vanderbilt did not foul that much because Ole Miss just simply, whenever they were coming back, they were driving to the goal and dishing and doing all of the stuff that makes Ole Miss pretty good. Whenever the Ole Miss stops doing this, they are not a very good team. In fact, in this game, you can see exactly how Ole Miss is a first-round exit in the NCAA tournament and a Sweet 16 team. It was both in the same game. It depends on which version of Ole Miss shows up, is their ability to do all of that. It was interesting stuff. And Ole Miss lost that game. And I described this game as a need to win, not a must win. It wasn't a must win game because Ole Miss is in the tournament. It was a need to win. And I'll tell you why it was a need to win. Ole Miss on their schedule in their last 4 games of the regular season over the next 2 weeks is at Auburn. That is a likely loss. And honestly, likely 20-point loss, if we're going to be honest. Auburn's really good at home, a really good team. We could play really well and get smoked down at Auburn. Then you have the home game against Oklahoma. Oklahoma's 4-10 in the SEC. They just beat Mississippi State, but that's a game you have to have. That has almost become a must-win ball game, but not because you want to get into the tournament or anything like that. It's just for good vibes, because after Oklahoma, you get Tennessee, who is a 2 seed like right now in the NCAA tournament and just won a game at Texas A&M, to where they shot lights out and it got weird and weird stuff happened. And at the end of the day, Tennessee ended up winning the game. And then you go to Gainesville in Florida, and that is likely number 1 seed in the tournament. Potentially the 2 best teams in all of college football right now, or college basketball right now, are Auburn and Florida. Both of those teams are national championship level teams, and Florida does a really good job of rebounding the basketball. So there's a chance that Ole Miss has L's coming, and not just L's, but kind of convincing L's against Auburn, Tennessee, and Florida. That's why that Oklahoma game becomes so important. You need that win just for good vibes. You need it for good feelings. You can't have a 6-game losing streak going into the SEC tournament to where if you lose that first game, you go into the NCAA tournament just limping. You need some good vibes. You need to feel good again with what's going on. You need to go into the tournament looking different. This basketball team at the moment had all the good vibes in the world a week ago. Before the Mississippi State game, everybody was talking about how far this basketball team could go. And then they just stopped doing what they were doing. The basketball team looked nothing like they have looked over the last couple of weeks. So Ole Miss against Oklahoma has almost become a must-win game. Again, not for the tournament or anything like that, just for good vibes and confidence. Because we all know that team sports revolve around confidence. Confident teams play better. That's the reason that Vanderbilt football in 2003 could give Ole Miss a game, even though Ole Miss was significantly better than Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt always thought they were in that game. They thought this was a game they could get. They played with confidence. They played over their heads. That is the reason they played that way. It was all confidence. Ole Miss needs to get good vibes back. Now, it would help if Ole Miss could pull an upset over Auburn, Tennessee, or Florida. Probabilities in that is not going to be high, especially on the road. Tennessee can struggle offensively, and if their outside shots aren't going down, Ole Miss has a real chance to win that game. I'm not saying that Tennessee is just going to beat Ole Miss, but I think statistically the probability of that happening is less than the probability of the Oklahoma game happening. That is a must-win, one of two homestand, period. It's not a situation to where you should feel okay with losing both of those games. And if Ole Miss were to lose to Oklahoma, I would probably bring the flamethrower at that point. I've been extremely kid gloves on this Ole Miss basketball team because the goal at the beginning of the season was to make the NCAA basketball tournament, and Ole Miss made the NCAA basketball tournament. So whenever that goal gets hit, it's kind of hard to really rain down on the team. But this Oklahoma game is a must-win game just for the good vibes within the program. If you want to do something in March, if you want to play that way, you need to win against Oklahoma. And it's going to be difficult. Ole Miss obviously got popped in the mouth against Mississippi State. Vanderbilt popped them in the mouth at the beginning of the game, a 19-point lead with 5 minutes to go in the first half. Auburn is likely going to punch you in the mouth. How are you going to get off the mat against Tennessee and against Oklahoma? That is the question. And how Ole Miss answers that is going to determine how their season gets defined as it goes forward. Thank you for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your go-to source for Ole Miss sports. We pride ourselves on offering the most comprehensive perspectives, which is why we're the number one Ole Miss podcast out there. Thank you very much. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out Locked On SEC podcast. Host Chris Gordy holds no punches, covering the best conference in all of college football. Find Locked On SEC on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Hotty toddy, everyone. And remember, analytics is just the old English word meaning bad football. We'll see you tomorrow.